Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a feverish summer in 1518 where cobblestone streets pulse beneath your feet and your limbs start to move without your permission. You're in Strasbourg under a sun that refuses to relent, watching dozens, then hundreds of people twist, spin, collapse, and rise again in a macabre ballet they can't seem to stop. Some laugh, some cry, and some die dancing. Yes, really. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Let's see who's got the weirdest time zone out there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear the music first, but there's no musician. It's in your head. Just a beat, faint but insistent like a pulse with no source. Then your heel taps. Then your fingers twitch. And suddenly, your whole body is moving violently, rhythmically, without permission. The townsfolk around you don't look concerned. They look relieved. It's not just you. Everyone's doing it. You're in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 and the world is sweating. It starts with one woman, Frau Trophea, stepping into the street and dancing like her bones are possessed. No music, no feast. Just a twitching, frenzied waltz of one. At first it's just weird. Then it's frightening. Because she doesn't stop. Not after a few hours. Not after a day. Not even after 3. By the end of the week, over 30 people are dancing with her. By the end of the month, nearly 400. Shoes wear thin, feet blister then bleed. Some collapse from exhaustion. Some quite literally dance until they die. Modern historians mostly agree this wasn't a flash mob gone wrong. Something very real and very bizarre happened. Theories fly like startled pigeons, ranging from ergot poisoning, that's a fungus on rye that mimics LSD, by the way, to stress-induced mass psychosis. You've probably never thought of bread as a psychedelic, but medieval bakers weren't exactly using FDA-approved methods. If their rye got a little wet, a mold called Claviceps purpurea would bloom full of alkaloids that twist the nervous system like a puppet on tangled strings. Hallucinations, muscle spasms, mania. Sound familiar? But here's where it gets slipperier than a grease-covered priest. Not everyone buys the fungus angle. The dancing didn't happen in isolated villages with a dodgy grain supply. It happened right in the city center. And no one reports eating the same bread. Plus, the outbreak lasted weeks. Mold doesn't keep you grooving that long. Some scholars argue the real plague was fear. Medieval life was, let's say, not relaxing. You had famines, plagues, taxes, invasions, and maybe a pope calling for your soul every other Tuesday. People were emotionally stretched tighter than a lute string, and group hysteria wasn't unheard of. They danced to purge the fear. Or maybe they danced because they thought they had to. Here's the weirdest part: city leaders didn't stop them. They built a stage. They hired musicians. They encouraged the dancing, hoping it would burn itself out. Doctors at the time figured the dancers had hot blood, a real diagnosis, believe it or not, and that more dancing was the cure. That's like treating smoke inhalation with bonfires. To cool off, they herded dancers to the shrine of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of epilepsy, and apparently involuntary dance parties. People prayed, bathed, bled themselves, or were exorcised, depending on how much the physician was charging that day. Some recovered, some didn't. There's a fringe theory, brace yourself, that maybe the dancers wanted to dance. Not consciously, no, but as an act of spiritual performance. In earlier centuries, dancing manias were sometimes linked to religious rituals, flagellants, and trance states. Think rave, but make it holy. Of course, historians still argue whether this was a one-off trauma response or part of a long medieval tradition of ecstatic outbreaks that just happened to get more dramatic in this one case. A less fun but definitely plausible idea is that the whole thing was a social contagion, like yawning or starting a TikTok challenge, but 1,000 times more medieval and deadly. You see one person dancing, you feel off, you start to twitch. Your brain connects the dots. This is what we do now. Cue the involuntary jig. There's even a whisper that authorities fabricated parts of it. One local chronicler might have exaggerated the death count for dramatic flair. Medieval journalists were the original clickbaiters. But contemporary reports do mention body's illness and unrelenting movement. Here's your quirky detail of the night some dancers reportedly wore bells around their ankles. Not for style, bells were thought to drive away spirits. Imagine a crowd of people twitching and jingling in 90-degree heat, while monks watch nervously, clutching prayer beads. That's not just history. That's a horror film waiting for a synth track. What's perhaps most haunting is the feeling you get walking through the square afterward. The cobblestones don't remember your name, but they remember the rhythm, the ghost of a footstep, the whisper of movement where none should be. Soho. It's not the music that gets to you, it's the silence that follows. And as you look around, you realize something unsettling. There were no witnesses. Everyone danced. Everyone was infected. No one was in control. That's what makes it terrifying. Not the dancing, the helplessness. Today, it's a quirky footnote in textbooks that time Europe boogied to death. But for the people who bled into the street, and for those still trying to explain why their ancestors spun themselves into shallow graves, it remains a riddle with no real punchline. If you're the paranoid type, you might wonder what would happen if it started again. All it would take is a weird news story, a few TikToks, a beat in your head you can't shake, and then, well, you'd better hope you've got good shoes. You're walking through the sun-bleached fields of Suffolk, England when you stop. There's something moving near a wolf pit. Two small figures, green-skinned and trembling, blinking under the daylight, like they've never seen it before. Their clothes shimmer oddly unfamiliar in both color and stitch. They don't speak. They don't run. They just stand there, eyes wide, whispering in a language no one understands. Welcome to Woolpit. It's the 12th century, and your afternoon has just taken a turn for the bizarre. The story survives thanks to a pair of chroniclers, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, both of whom, like all medieval writers, never met a good story they couldn't write down dramatically. They tell of a young boy and girl found near a pit meant for catching wolves, dazed, confused, and most memorably, entirely green. The villagers do what villagers do: stare, speculate, and eventually take the children in. The kids won't eat anything until someone brings out green beans. They devour them raw, like feral things, as if this were the first time they'd seen food that made sense. Within weeks, their skin begins to fade from green to human pink. Their health improves, but the boy doesn't make it. He dies shortly after baptism, which, to be honest, was a bit of a gamble in those days. The girl survives. She learns English. She becomes part of the community. And then slowly, she begins to talk. She says they came from a place with no sun, only twilight. Everyone there was green. She calls it St. Martin's Land. According to her, the two of them had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud sound, bells, she says. Then, darkness. Then they were here. Now let's take a moment. Imagine you're hearing this not in a bedtime video, but in a dark forest around a fire. This girl, pale now, but once green, is describing a world under the ground, or maybe behind a veil. She isn't trying to scare you. She's just telling you what happened. You can't quite decide what's more chilling, the strangeness or how matter-of-fact she is. Some historians think the tale is allegorical, maybe about displaced Flemish refugees who wandered into England, speaking a strange language, wearing unfamiliar clothes, and possibly malnourished enough to develop a greenish tint from anemia. You know, the fun kind. That's your mainstream fact of the night. Green skin can result from hypochromic anemia, usually caused by a strict diet lacking iron. Combine that with starvation and a chronic lack of sunshine, voila. You've got a mystery that starts to look a bit more explainable under fluorescent lighting. But there's always more under the surface. The Woolpit region was full of old Anglo-Saxon legends, including tales of hollow hills and fairy realms. In many of these, time moves differently. Food tastes sweeter, and the people aren't quite like us. Fringe theorists, and you knew we'd get here, have speculated about everything from hollow earth to interdimensional portals. And yes, ancient aliens always somehow sneak into the comments. Others suggest this might have been a warped memory of child trafficking kids displaced by war or famine, dumped into strange lands, too traumatized to speak coherently. And a good storyteller wraps the horror in fantasy. It's easier to digest. You can tell yourself it wasn't real, just a tale. Still, historians argue whether this was a genuine folk memory of real events, or just another medieval campfire story that somehow wandered into the chronicles. The fact that two separate writers recorded it lends a certain weight, but then again, both men were more interested in preserving interesting stories than verifiable ones. Here's a quirky nugget: some local traditions held that the Green Children's Village had been struck by a plague, and everyone except the kids had perished underground. The color came from mold in the tunnels. It's the kind of detail that's just believable enough to make you shiver. Like, sure, that makes sense, and also, I never want to go into a tunnel again. The girl, whose name may have been Agnes, eventually assimilates. She becomes a servant, then marries, then fades from history. That part entirely believable. Countless medieval women lived whole lives unrecorded, except when they became interesting. But the strangeness lingers. It doesn't fade with her skin. Some scholars argue the green detail is a misinterpretation, maybe a metaphor for cultural otherness or spiritual impurity. After all, medieval writers loved color symbolism more than Instagram loves filters. Green could mean youth sickness or alienness, or all three. And then there's the bells. Remember those? That strange chime the children heard before slipping between worlds. The sound that drew them away from their herds and into the light. That's not a throwaway detail. Bells were deeply symbolic in medieval culture, used in churches, of course, but also thought to ward off evil, mark sacred time, or guide souls. If you heard bells, you listened. Sometimes you followed. You're sitting in Woolpit now. It's quiet. There's no sign of children, green or otherwise. Just a few pit markers and a lingering unease. You can almost hear the soft clang of a bell, distant, maybe underground. And here's a thought that might keep you from sleeping. What if the children weren't lost? What if they were sent? After all, they never tried to go back. Not once. The girl didn't even ask. Maybe because they couldn't. Or maybe because they knew something we don't. The courtroom smells like damp stone candle wax and something much worse, decay. You sit stiff-backed on a cold bench surrounded by murmuring clergy and sour-faced nobles. In front of you, the accused slouches grotesquely on a throne meant for the living. His skin is gray. His eyes are empty sockets. He is very much dead. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod. Yes, this really happened. It's January 897 AD in Rome, and you are watching a pope put another dead pope on trial. Not metaphorically, not in absentia. He's here in person, or what's left of him. That's Pope Formosus, corpse in chief tonight. He's been exhumed after 9 months in the ground, dressed in full papal vestments, propped up on a throne, and now a deacon is standing beside him speaking for him, in a parody of legal defense that makes your stomach turn. You're not dreaming. You're just in the 9th century Vatican. The new Pope Stephen VI, sometimes chapter 7, depending on how you count the anti-pope's paces, like a lawyer with a vendetta. He accuses Formosus of breaking canon law, of usurping the papacy, of shifting loyalties between rival kings, like a medieval political chameleon. It's not really about sin. It's about power. Formosus had enemies both in Rome and beyond. During his reign, he'd backed the wrong guy, Arnulf of Carinthia, against Lambert of Spoleto, the current favorite. Now Lambert wants revenge, and Pope Stephen is happy to deliver it. You glance around and realize something grim. This isn't justice. It's theater, public shaming, spiritual sabotage. But with props, the deacon mumbles responses on behalf of the corpse. "I am guilty," he says in a monotone over the groan of shifting bodies. At one point, Formosus's corpse slumps to one side, and attendants rush forward to prop him back up. His fingers blackened and brittle twitch slightly as a rat runs beneath the bench. Medieval justice, ladies and gentlemen. The trial ends with a verdict you already expected: guilty on all counts. His papacy is declared invalid. All his acts are annulled. His vestments are stripped from his corpse. The 3 fingers he used for blessings are cut off. They say it's symbolic. You're not so sure. Then they drag him through the streets and toss him into the Tiber. Let's pause for breath. You're probably wondering, why go through all this trouble? Why not just write a strongly worded letter to the Archbishop and move on? Well, here's your historical fact. In the early medieval church, legitimacy was everything. If a pope was declared illegitimate, then every bishop, every ordination, every appointment under his reign could be questioned. If you hated a bishop Formosus appointed, this was your loophole. Plus, Pope Stephen was under pressure. Rome was a volatile place. You had factions loyal to various noble families, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy itself, each with daggers-out alliances, shifting like mud under your boots. Putting Formosus on trial wasn't just an exorcism, it was an erasure. But here's the twist: it backfires. Badly. People are horrified. Even by medieval standards, digging up your predecessor and cutting off his fingers is a little much. Within months, Stephen is imprisoned. He dies under suspicious circumstances, probably strangled in his cell. Public opinion sways. Formosus is reburied twice and eventually reinstated. Historians still argue whether Stephen was acting alone or was pressured by Spoleto allies, possibly even Lambert himself. There's no smoking scroll, just layers of political spite and clerical paranoia baked into a corpse. Here's your quirky tidbit: after the Cadaver Synod, the Church decided officially that popes could not put dead people on trial, because apparently they needed to write that down. For years afterward, the papacy whiplashed between pro-Formosus and anti-Formosus factions. One pope would restore his honors. The next would dig him up again, or at least try to. His body disappeared into the river, remember? It was like a macabre game of theological ping-pong with a rotting pontiff as the ball. You may laugh softly because the guards here still glare, but this wasn't a fringe event. This was the Vatican. This was power at its ugliest. You can still find echoes of it in legal theory, church politics, and even the weird doctrine of papal infallibility that evolved centuries later. Because once you've seen a pope make another pope's corpse confess to high crimes, you start to ask very serious questions about divine authority. And perhaps more unsettlingly, you realize something about the medieval mind. The body wasn't just a vessel, it was evidence. To desecrate a corpse was to desecrate a legacy. To mutilate it was to prove viscerally that this man had no favor with God. It wasn't enough for Formosus to be wrong. He had to look wrong. Some versions of the story say his body washed up weeks later on the banks of the Tiber, half-eaten, missing fingers, but somehow preserved by the cold. Locals claimed it performed miracles. The man the church tried to erase became a relic in death. Even the worms apparently refused to finish him. So you sit now in the flickering torchlight of this strange courtroom, watching bishops with trembling hands pronounce judgment on a man who cannot speak. And you wonder quietly, carefully, how many other sins have been buried, only to rise again in a judge's robe. Not all ghosts wear chains. Some wear papal rings. You arrive in Wilsnack, northern Germany, sometime in the late 1300s, and something about the church here feels sticky. Not from spilled wine or candle wax. No, it's the blood. The holy blood, or so they say. You're led toward the altar where 3 communion wafers lie on display, pale, circular, and speckled with what looks like crimson stains. The air smells of incense and old stone, but underneath it, there's a coppery tinge that tickles your throat. People around you weep. Some crawl on their knees. One woman faints dramatically twice. This is the shrine of the bleeding hosts of Wilsnack. And tonight, you're going to see a miracle, or a scam. Depends who you ask. Let's rewind. It's 1383, and the town of Wilsnack has just been sacked, burned to the ground, by Heinrich von Bülow, a noble with questionable boundaries. In the ruins of the parish church, a priest claims to find 3 undamaged hosts, communion wafers, surviving the fire miraculously untouched. And not just untouched, they're bleeding. Naturally, the priest tells everyone. Word spreads like wildfire, this time the metaphorical kind. Pilgrims begin arriving in droves, hobbling, crawling, chanting, hoping to see the miracle with their own eyes. The church is rebuilt. The hosts are enshrined. And the town, once ashes, becomes an unlikely religious goldmine. Here's your mainstream fact: pilgrimages were a big deal in medieval Europe. Entire economies bloomed around relics. A single saint's finger could feed a town. A cloak that allegedly touched the Virgin Mary. That's your cathedral budget sorted for the decade. So 3 bleeding hosts. That's the medieval jackpot. Wilsnack transforms almost overnight. Inns open. Roads are repaired, merchants move in, and the bishops, those always astute real estate strategists, build bigger and grander sanctuaries to house the wafers. Donations pour in, miracles are recorded. People claim healings, visions, and even resurrections. And here you are, squeezed between a barefoot monk and a nun who's whispering the Lord's Prayer while gripping her rosary hard enough to leave marks. You squint at the wafers. They don't look fresh, more like scabs on stale bread. But the story's already wrapped itself around your senses. There's something hypnotic about the silence in this space, how a simple wafer can hold so much power. Not everyone is buying it, though. In fact, some of the loudest critics come from inside the church. One particularly skeptical bishop of Brandenburg calls the miracle a fraud designed to attract crowds and wealth. He even sends officials to examine the hosts. No natural explanation is found, but the doubt festers. Historians still argue whether the blood was real or faked, maybe dried animal blood, or a subtle chemical reaction involving iron salts and humidity. Not exactly chemistry class, but close enough to fool a crowd in 1383. And here's your fringe tidbit. One theory suggests the wafers were prepared with a special mixture, animal fat, pig's blood, and a binding agent to simulate old blood without rotting. It's either ecclesiastical innovation or sacrilegious performance art, depending on how full your offering box is. You overhear whispers that pilgrims who question the miracle sometimes go missing, that merchants in nearby towns complain about Wilsnack's sudden wealth, that rival churches petition the Pope to declare the site heretical. Spoiler, it doesn't work. The papacy notably fractured during this period with competing claimants high. Western Schism gives a lukewarm nod, but never shuts Wilsnack down. In fact, Pope Eugene IV, decades later, issues a bull that essentially says, "Sure, let them believe, but maybe ease off the whole bleeding thing a bit." So the spectacle continues. Some visitors report strange side effects, dizziness, nausea, even uncontrollable weeping. You begin to wonder whether the incense is mixed with something else. Fumes from the wax, molds in the rafters, or just spiritual intensity pushing people toward the edge. Then there's the guide, a grinning priest who, with a voice like syrup, reminds you that donations ensure the host's safety. He rattles a small box with coins in it and locks eyes with you for just a little too long. You drop in a silver penny. "God sees your heart," he says, smiling, "and your wallet." You nod politely and back away. The real mystery, though, is the persistence. This wasn't a one-off miracle. The bleeding hosts of Wilsnack drew crowds for nearly 170 years. Even Martin Luther, that rebellious monk with a thesis problem, mentions them with contempt in the 16th century. By then, of course, Europe was changing. Reform was coming. The age of unquestioned relics was cracking, just like the wafer behind the altar. Eventually, the shrine was dismantled. The hosts disappeared. No one knows quite what happened to them, burned, buried, or hidden in some forgotten cathedral vault. But here's what lingers: the idea that miracles could be manufactured, that faith, for all its purity, could be harnessed like wind through a mill. The people wanted hope. The church gave them blood-stained wafers, and for a time everyone got what they needed. You step out of the cathedral into the crisp night air. Pilgrims snore softly in tents. Merchants count coins under lantern light. Somewhere behind you, incense still burns, and 3 dry, red-smeared wafers rest in a crystal case guarded by men who've learned that nothing draws a crowd quite like the hint of holy blood. The stone is warm beneath your palms, sun-soaked and ancient. Dust drifts lazily in the narrow shaft of light that cuts through the abbey's high window. The silence here is heavy, not peaceful, but sealed. A silence that's been bricked in like the girl you're about to meet. No screams, no whimpers. Just a single thread of song, almost too faint to hear. You've entered a cell not meant to be exited. This is the world of the immured nuns, young women enclosed alive within walls, committed to a life of devotion, isolation, and often madness. They call them anchoresses, but the term is almost too gentle for what's really happening. You press your ear to the stone. On the other side, she's still in there. Has been for years. In the medieval mind, enclosure was holiness made physical. To shut oneself away from the world was not a punishment. It was a form of spiritual superiority, or so they claimed. The typical anchor hold or reclusorium was barely larger than a closet. 3 windows, one to the chapel, to hear Mass, one to receive food, and one if she was lucky to speak with pilgrims. The door sealed with a ceremony not unlike a funeral. She was for all practical purposes dead to the world. That's your historical fact. Anchoritism was a widely accepted religious practice throughout the Middle Ages, particularly in England and parts of Germany. It reached its peak between the 12th and 14th centuries. These women were revered, written about, even sought out for spiritual advice. Saints in stone. But let's not gloss over the horror. You're living inside a brick box no bigger than your bathroom, forever. Some nuns chose it, some didn't. That's where things get darker. Families, especially noble ones, could force daughters into enclosure. Dowry too expensive. Want one less heir to worry about, brick her in. Dress it up in religious language, said a bishop's blessing, and voila, she's God's problem now. Historians still argue whether most anchoresses entered willingly or were coerced. Some left behind writings, visions, prayers, even manuals for other aspiring recluses. The most famous is Ancrene Wisse, a 13th century guidebook written in Middle English for three sisters who chose the enclosed life. It outlines everything from spiritual practice to hygiene. Spoiler, not great. But what you don't read about in the official accounts are the sounds, the pacing, the scraping, the crying, the sheer inescapable boredom. Even the most pious mind can fray in silence. Here's your quirky detail. Some anchor holds were built next to cemeteries, so the nun could watch funerals. Cheery. Others had a squint, a narrow slit carved through the wall so she could peek at the altar during Mass. It's like spiritual Twitch streaming, but in reverse. You imagine the walls closing in, the stale air, the smell of damp stone and sweat and candle smoke, the endless loop of prayer, the slow unspooling of time. Years blur, decades pass. The world changes outside, but inside everything is the same, until it isn't. Because here's the mystery: some immured women disappeared, not buried, not exhumed, just gone. A few anchor holds, when opened generations later, were found empty. There's speculation, of course. Did sympathetic clergy help them escape? Did they tunnel out with fingernails and willpower, or in this one shows up in folklore? Did some of them achieve such holiness that they were taken directly into heaven, all bodies and all? More likely, someone bricked them in, then quietly unbricked them again when politics shifted or guilt became inconvenient. Still, there's a bone-deep discomfort here. Even if the nun agreed to her imprisonment, what happens when she changes her mind? There's no lock on the inside. One case in York tells of a woman, Lady Cecilia, who begged to be let out after 2 years. Her confessor refused, citing her vows to Christ. She died within 6 months. Her bones were found curled beneath the squint window, where she could just barely see the altar. That's the part that sticks with you. The almost. Not quite seeing the world. Not quite touching sunlight. Not quite escaping. The church never officially outlawed the practice, though the Reformation and changes in monastic culture eventually caused it to fade. By the 16th century, the anchor hold became less a destination and more a relic of a stricter, stranger age. But traces remain. In some ruined abbeys, the outlines of the cells still scar the stone. You can kneel there and imagine the voice behind the wall. You can picture her fingers brushing the edge of the opening. You can almost hear her ask softly, "Is it still raining?" You shift now back in the present and think about how humans sometimes chase holiness in the harshest ways. How silence becomes performance. How enclosure becomes obsession. How sainthood, when left in the dark long enough, begins to rot like anything else. And as you leave the abbey, ruins wind stirring your cloak, you realize it's not the wall that frightens you. It's how easy it is to believe that being walled in is better than being seen. You wake in a cell that isn't a cell. Polished floor silk linens, a gold-threaded curtain fluttering in the stale breeze, but the door is locked. Always. You don't remember your name. No one uses it. They just call you the man, or if they're feeling dramatic, l'homme au masque de fer. Yes, the man in the iron mask. And no, not just a Dumas novel or a Leonardo DiCaprio fever dream. Before it was fiction, it was fact, or at least the kind of fact that French courtiers whispered about behind velvet fans, eyes darting toward Versailles. The mystery begins in 1669 when a man is imprisoned under the strictest secrecy by order of King Louis XIV. He's held in one fortress, then transferred to another, always under the watch of the same jailer, Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, and always in a mask. According to some accounts, the mask was velvet at first, then metal, eventually iron, bolted shut. This isn't a quick imprisonment. He isn't executed. He lives this way for decades, in silence, in anonymity. He dies in 1703 at the Bastille, buried under the name Marchioli, a name that appears nowhere else in official records. His cell is stripped. Everything he touched is burned, even his plates. You might think that's excessive. The French crown certainly didn't, because whoever this man was, his identity was dangerous. Your mainstream fact, Louis XIV ruled longer than any monarch in European history, 72 years. He was obsessed with image order and divine authority. Nothing threatened him more than chaos, and nothing causes chaos quite like a secret wrapped in iron. Over the centuries, theories piled up like powdered wigs. Was he Louis's illegitimate brother, a twin, hidden to preserve royal succession? A disgraced noble, an Italian diplomat? Some said he was Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli, an Italian politician who betrayed Louis during treaty negotiations. But Mattioli's imprisonment was no secret, and he died before the man in the mask. Others pointed fingers at Eustache Dogger, a valet arrested for unknown crimes in 1669, the exact year our masked man appeared. The timeline fits, but a valet seems too minor to merit this much drama. Unless, of course, he saw something, or knew something. Historians still argue whether Dogger was merely a scapegoat or the victim of mistaken identity. One theory suggests he overheard royal secrets, illicit affairs, poisonings, plans for war. Not enough to kill him, but far too much to ever let him leave. Then there's the twin theory made famous by Dumas, but with roots in earlier rumors. If the king had a twin brother, even a younger one, it could challenge the divine right of kings. Because if birth order determines God's chosen ruler, and you can't prove who came first, well, good luck keeping that crown straight. But here's your quirky tidbit. In several fortress records, guards note that the masked prisoner was treated with surprising dignity. He had books, decent meals, a private cell, even wine. The mask, however, stayed on at all times, especially during transfers. There are stories, possibly exaggerated, that he was forced to sleep in it, bathe in it, and that if he removed it, he'd be executed on the spot. And then there's Saint-Mars, the jailer. He stayed with the prisoner for 34 years across 4 different prisons. That's not normal. Jailers were rotated like crops. But Saint-Mars guarded this one man like a sacred relic or a curse. One of the most disturbing entries in the Bastille's records. A note about the man's corpse. When buried, his face was covered. Even in death, the mask stayed on. Was it to preserve secrecy or to hide a face too familiar? A 19th century excavation of what might have been his grave turned up bones, but no mask. Theories reignited. Maybe it was never iron. Maybe it was leather wax or a theatrical invention. But the idea had already taken hold. You think about him now, pacing behind the bars of some forgotten cell in the Alps, the iron pressing into his skin. Unable to speak his name. Unsure whether he even remembers it. That's the part that gnaws at you, not the imprisonment, but the erasure. A man reduced to a rumor. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if anyone remembers you exist. Or worse, what if someone does, and that's why you're here? You run your fingers along the cold wall, wondering how long it would take before silence becomes identity. Before the mask isn't something you wear, but something you are. At night, they say the masked man would hum, softly, melodies no one recognized. Perhaps lullabies from a past he couldn't speak of, or codes only he understood. Maybe the mask wasn't just to hide his face. Maybe it was to keep the truth inside. And now, centuries later, France still remembers a man it never really knew. Statues, films, theories on late-night talk shows. No name, no face, just a mystery sealed in metal. You turn away from the fortress window, and in the reflection of the darkened glass, you think you see a second figure standing behind you, silent, watchful, masked. You blink. You're alone. Or are you? You flip open the book. No scratch that you try to flip open the book, but it fights you like it knows you're not supposed to be reading it. The vellum pages groan like dry skin packed with loops and stalks of script that belong to no known language. Illustrations leap at you, naked women, bathing in green, ooze, star-shaped flowers that don't exist, diagrams of constellations that don't belong to our sky. You've just met the Voynich manuscript, and if you're looking for answers, you'd better settle in. Because no one has ever read it. Not even close. Found in 1912 by rare book dealer Wilfred Voynich. Hence the name, the manuscript immediately fried the circuits of every scholar and cryptographer who touched it. It's written in a tight flowing script, call it Voynichese, for lack of a better word, that resembles natural language but behaves like nothing on Earth. You flip another page. There are biological diagrams, almost medical, but no organs you recognize. A circular map with unknown cosmology. And always the green bathing women climbing tubes, entering pools, interacting with unknown technology or maybe plants. Mainstream historians will tell you this. The manuscript is probably 15th century based on carbon dating of the parchment. The ink matches too. That's your historical fact. So it's not a modern fake, even though it sometimes feels like one. And it's long. Around 240 pages survive. There might have been more, might have been less. It's hard to say what's missing when you can't read the table of contents. Voynich, a Polish-Lithuanian collector with a flair for the dramatic, found the book in the Jesuit Collegio Romano. Where it came from before that, unclear. There are whispers of it being part of Emperor Rudolf II's alchemical library. He loved weird stuff. Bought a stuffed dodo once. That's your quirky detail. Rudolf II might have thought the manuscript was written by Roger Bacon, a 13th century philosopher who dipped his toes into optics, alchemy, and other dangerously interesting topics. Spoiler, it almost certainly wasn't. The writing flows like a real language. It has repeating structures, prefixes, suffixes. It should be decipherable. But hundreds, maybe thousands of cryptographers have tried. WW2 code breakers, CIA linguists, AI programs. Nada. One team even used neural networks trained on all human language families. Still nothing. Historians still argue whether it's an uncracked cipher, a forgotten constructed language, or, and here's where things go sideways, a very elaborate hoax. But if it's a hoax, it's a genius one. The writing obeys patterns that match natural language frequency distributions. That's not easy to fake. In fact, it would be nearly impossible for someone in the 15th century to produce convincing gibberish that behaves so believably like real speech without accidentally making it readable. That's what keeps the experts up at night. The illustrations offer no comfort. The plants, none are identifiable. The herbal section seems to combine real species into impossible hybrids. It's like a botanical fever dream. The astronomical pages show stars and moons and naked women riding something like intestines through orbital rings. The pharmaceutical section features jars and roots that might be recipes or just elaborate doodles. There's a recipes section with star-shaped flowers and cryptic marginal notes that look more like spells than soups. You lean in. Try to focus on one character. Just one symbol. It wiggles. You blink. Rub your eyes. Maybe not. There are theories, of course. The manuscript might be an alchemical text written in a private cipher to guard dangerous secrets. Maybe it was a medical book, a fertility guide, a women's health manual encoded to hide knowledge from the church. Then again, maybe it wasn't written for humans at all. One fringe theory suggests it's the record of a vision, a hallucination, or even a transcription of a dream language, something channeled rather than written. Some have gone so far as to claim it's alien or a gift from a parallel civilization. Okay. Deep breath. It's probably not alien. Probably. More grounded but still wild is the theory that it's glossolalia writing produced in a trance state, similar to speaking in tongues. That would explain the natural structure without meaning. The words feel alive but go nowhere, like a song in a language your brain almost recognizes. One researcher proposed the entire thing was created as a memory palace, a visual mnemonic device so personal no one else could ever use it. Imagine writing your own secret language to store thoughts, images, recipes, medical observations, and then dying before telling anyone the key. Kind of romantic, kind of tragic, and kind of useless to modern cryptographers who continue to pull their hair out, trying to extract meaning from a text that laughs silently at every effort. So here you sit in front of the Voynich manuscript, its parchment slightly warped, its illustrations cheerfully meaningless. You wonder who the author was, whether they smiled as they inked these absurd little women with their gravity-defying hair and leaf-shaped pools. Did they know it would be unreadable forever? Did they want that because that's the part that chills you, not the mystery, but the possibility that it's not meant to be solved? That the point is the unknowing? That the manuscript isn't a puzzle but a trap for curious minds? You close it, gently. Some books want to be read. This one wants to be remembered. The smell hits you first, leather dust, and something sour underneath, like old blood or rotting fruit. You're in a throne room, but the throne is empty. The man sitting beside it coughs quietly into a silk kerchief, which he tucks away like nothing happened. You caught a glimpse, though. The skin on his hand is pale and dappled. He's a king, and he's a leper. Tonight you're stepping into the strange and unsettling world of medieval leper royalty, men and women born to rule, but touched by a disease so feared it was thought to be divine punishment. Welcome to the court of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the so-called leper king. He ruled in the late 12th century during the height of the Crusader kingdoms. And yes, he really had leprosy, probably what we'd now call Hansen's disease. But what's fascinating and frankly a little unnerving is that Baldwin kept ruling for over a decade. Hands deteriorating, skin flaking, limbs weakening, and yet his mind stayed sharp. His commanders followed him. His nobles begrudgingly respected him. Even Saladin, his Muslim rival, feared him as a tactician. Here's your mainstream fact: leprosy was seen in the Middle Ages not just as a disease, but as a symbol, a mark, a sign of spiritual impurity or divine punishment, or sometimes, paradoxically, holy suffering. Some saints were thought to have contracted leprosy as a kind of martyrdom. But rulers, that was harder to swallow. And yet Baldwin was crowned at age 13. He wore gloves in court, not to hide deformity, but to prevent contagion. People bowed to him, even as they watched his nose begin to flatten, his fingers curl. They murmured, but they obeyed. There were others. Queen Hedwig of Silesia was rumored to have contracted leprosy in secret, treated only by monks who dared not speak of her condition. King Henry VII of Germany was accused, possibly falsely, of having the white sickness. Even certain popes were whispered to have hidden sores. Historians still argue whether these cases were true leprosy or medieval misdiagnoses. The disease was a catch-all category for skin ailments, psoriasis, eczema, even advanced syphilis, though that particular delight came a bit later. But once the label stuck, it never washed off. Here's your quirky detail. Leper royalty were sometimes issued special leper coins, currency believed to be clean because it passed only through the hands of the afflicted. In some regions, these coins were melted down when the ruler died, as if the disease clung to the metal. And yet these kings and queens persisted. Some ruled longer than their healthy peers. Their condition was whispered about, yes, but it didn't always dethrone them. Which leads to the darker question, why power, of course? Royal bloodline trumped rotting flesh, and the medieval mind was deeply conflicted about illness. On the one hand, sickness was a curse. On the other, it was a test. A ruler who suffered might be seen as enduring punishment on behalf of their people, a kind of walking sacrifice. You lean back from the throne room's edge and picture it, a king wrapped in linen hands, gloved lips cracked, speaking in a low voice while nobles strain to hear, strategizing, commanding, while his body falls apart like parchment in rain. What kind of loyalty does that inspire? Fear, pity, awe? Or something more practical? Because here's the twist, leprosy spreads slowly. And it's not that contagious. Certainly not by 12th century standards where just drinking water was a gamble. Baldwin may have looked ghastly, but he wasn't a plague vector. The fear was mostly symbolic. And symbols, as you've learned by now, are powerful currency. You overhear a monk describe the king as touched by God's fire. Not damned, marked. A living martyr ruling in pain for the salvation of others. He says this with reverence, then immediately wipes his hands on his robe. That tension never left the medieval world. Leper kings existed at the knife edge of respect and revulsion. They were feared, followed, and ultimately forgotten. Their portraits fade, their names blur, but the legacy that lingers. Even today, the image of the leper king survives in fantasy games and film, always half saint, half ghoul. A ruler in rags and gold falling apart on a throne no one else dares touch. You walk past the empty chair now. The cushion still bears an imprint. A few flakes of dry skin catch the light like dust motes. You try not to breathe too deeply. And then you spot it half hidden behind a curtain, a carved wooden box sealed with wax. On it, a name is scratched in jagged Latin. Not Baldwin, not Hedwig. Just Rex Morbus, the diseased king. No one dares open it. Maybe inside is a crown, or bone. Or maybe, just maybe, a letter no one dared deliver. Written by a monarch who ruled through rot, whispering his commands through crumbling lips. You back away. Some thrones weren't built to last. Your calendar says it's 2025, your phone agrees. So does your laptop, your watch, and that cursed wall clock in your grandmother's kitchen that's been stuck at 11 for the past 3 years. But what if it's not? What if it's actually the year 1728? What if 3 centuries of history battles emperors, the invention of trousers with pockets, never happened at all? Tonight you stumble headfirst into one of the strangest and most fun medieval conspiracy theories of all time. The phantom time hypothesis. Grab your astrolabe. You're going to need it. The idea is simple and outrageous. A German historian named Heribert Illig proposed in the 1990s that 297 years of history, specifically AD 614 to 911, are fake, fabricated, inserted into the calendar like a forged receipt in a royal ledger. According to Illig Charlemagne, the father of Europe, the first Holy Roman Emperor, the guy who practically invented the idea of medieval kingship never existed. He's a myth, and you're living nearly 300 years earlier than you think. Bold claim, right? But Illig wasn't just waving around a tinfoil tiara. He had his reasons. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Our current dating system, the Gregorian calendar, was introduced in 1582 to fix a problem in the Julian calendar, which was drifting slowly out of sync with the solar year. The correction dropped 10 days to bring everything back in line. But here's where it gets odd. The Julian calendar had been drifting by about 1 day every 128 years, so by 1582, it should have been off by 13 days, not 10. So where did those 3 missing days go? Illig's answer. They weren't missing. They never happened. You stand in the cathedral square blinking into the hazy torchlight as the centuries wobble beneath your boots like a cracked floorboard. According to the theory, someone most likely Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, possibly with Pope Sylvester II and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, inserted those years into the historical timeline. Why? To place themselves at the prestigious turn of the first millennium, AD 1000. People love round numbers. But faking 3 centuries, that's a big lift even for an emperor with a quill and a dream. You'd have to forge documents, invent monarchs, create battles, shift entire genealogies. Unless that time wasn't so well documented to begin with. Which brings us to one of Illig's favorite points, the Dark Age gap. He claimed that from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, around 476 AD, to the start of the High Middle Ages, roughly 1000 AD, there's a suspicious lack of cultural, architectural, and technological progress. Fewer buildings, fewer inventions, fewer records, almost like there were fewer years. Historians still argue whether that gap is real or just a result of surviving sources being uneven destroyed or simply never written down. After all, Europe was a chaotic mess during that time. Plague, migration, Viking raids, paper shortages, you name it. But if you squint hard enough, especially with 90s-era German skepticism, history starts to look more like a patchwork than a timeline. And someone could have slipped a few centuries in there when no one was watching. Here's your quirky tidbit. Illig even pointed to architecture as evidence. Specifically, he questioned how the stunning Aachen Cathedral, attributed to Charlemagne around 800 AD, looked more like 11th century buildings than anything from its supposed era. He saw that as proof the building and the king were backdated. Skeptics, of course, have piled onto the theory with torches and pitchforks, both metaphorical and academic. They point to dated eclipses in historical texts that match astronomical records. They point to Chinese and Islamic sources, which don't seem to have lost any centuries. And they laugh gently at the idea that a calendar mismatch means fabricated time. Still, the theory persists, because there's something delicious about the idea that your entire understanding of the past might be based on a bureaucratic lie, that we built museums and wrote textbooks and named airports after people who may never have drawn breath. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, conqueror of Saxons, founder of the Carolingian Renaissance, might just be the world's most successful medieval fictional character, the Mona Lisa of monarchs. You sit now in a monastery scriptorium, watching scribes hunched over parchments by candlelight. You lean close just behind one monk's shoulder and see him draw the outline of a man with a beard, a crown, and a Latin inscription Carolus Magnus. He pauses, smiles to himself, then dips his pen in ink and writes, "Reigned from 768 to 814. You whisper, "Did he?" The monk doesn't answer. Some say Illig's theory is just harmless historical trolling, a medieval flavor of calendar conspiracy. But others take it seriously. And why not? The past is just stories. Ink, chisel, dust. All it takes is one lie written in gold leaf stored in a church library, and suddenly a whole empire exists. So tonight, as you scroll through your phone or glance at your calendar app, remember the numbers might lie. Time, as always, is what we make of it, or what someone made you believe. You stand at the edge of a seething crowd, mud-streaked faces, tear-stained cheeks, dirty little hands clasped around walking sticks and wooden crosses. Not knights, not men, children, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All of them moving toward a horizon they can't pronounce. The year is 1212, and the Children's Crusade is just beginning. This isn't some dreamy youth movement or medieval summer camp. It's a mass pilgrimage, or perhaps something darker, where the innocent are supposed to succeed where armies failed. Because adults, as the church quietly admits by this point, have been terrible at liberating Jerusalem. So why not send the pure? The story splits here like a medieval manuscript, with wine spilled across its margins. Some say it began in France, others in Germany. One version starts with a boy named Stephen of Cloyes, a shepherd who claimed Jesus gave him a letter to deliver to the King of France. The letter apparently demanded a peaceful crusade led by children to reclaim the Holy Land. The king, unsurprisingly, was unmoved. But the people, they listened, and soon Stephen was leading a growing throng of children, some as young as 7, through villages and cities, gathering followers like a prophet with a flute. Sound familiar? Another account tells of Nicholas of Cologne, who rallied thousands of German youths, declaring that the Mediterranean Sea would part for them, just as it did for Moses, allowing them to walk to Jerusalem unharmed. Spoiler, it didn't. You watch the procession. Tattered shoes, bleeding feet, children carrying babies. More than a few adults trailing behind some kindly monks, sure but also thieves, sellers of relics, maybe a few people who look just a little too eager to help. Here's your historical fact. The Crusades weren't a single event, but a series of religiously sanctioned campaigns that spanned centuries. By 1212, the failure of adult crusaders had become a source of both shame and satire. The idea that children uncorrupted by sin might succeed where armored men failed wasn't just romantic, it was politically convenient. But the logistics, an absolute disaster. Reports differ wildly, but some sources claim up to 30,000 children joined the movement. Modern historians say that number is inflated, probably by storytellers looking for moral tragedy. But there's no doubt the event happened. The question is, what kind of event it was? Historians still argue whether the Children's Crusade was a genuine mass movement, a series of disjointed youth pilgrimages, or a moral allegory that got taken too literally over time. Some even suggest it wasn't just children. Plenty of adolescents, poor laborers, and peasants likely tagged along, blurring the narrative. But let's go with the story that made it into the annals of horror. Stephen's group, after wandering across France and not parting any seas, allegedly arrived at Marseille, where 2 merchants named Hugh the Iron and William the Pig offered them free passage to the Holy Land, which sounds generous. 6 ships sailed away. Only 2 were ever heard from again. The rest sold into slavery. Your quirky detail, some chroniclers claimed the 2 kind merchants had prearranged to sell the children to North African slave markets. They profited handsomely. One even tried to justify it by saying it was God's will. Because of course he did. Back in Germany, Nicholas's crusade didn't fare much better. He led his group across the Alps in winter, resulting in hundreds of deaths from exposure and starvation. The survivors who reached Italy were turned away by skeptical cities. Many tried to return home. Most did not make it. Some were absorbed into monasteries. Some vanished. A few reportedly reached the coast and later returned as broken adults. There's a German legend of a father finding his son decades later, tanned like leather, speaking Arabic, and unable to remember how he got back. It's easy to dismiss the whole thing as mass hysteria or medieval idealism gone off the rails. But here's where it tightens around your chest. No one stopped them. The church offered only half-hearted condemnations. Towns let them pass. Adults watched from windows. Maybe they believed in the cause. Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe, and this is the part you try not to think about, maybe it was easier to let the children go than to tell them no. Even now, the story haunts Europe. In cloisters and churches, there are frescoes and carvings of child crusaders with blank eyes and broken staffs. One 14th century hymn references a song that crossed the sea but did not return. You wonder what those songs sounded like. You picture a little boy clutching a wooden sword, singing about Jerusalem without knowing where it is. You picture the moment the sea didn't part, the moment the ship doors closed, the moment he realized no one was coming to help. And then you wonder, were they really children? Because that's another theory, that the children were actually the pauperes, the poor and uneducated masses called children of God in popular sermons. The word pueri in Latin could mean boys, but it could also mean servants, peasants, or simply the low-born. In that case, the tragedy becomes no less real, just reframed. Whether they were kids or just people who had no business marching into the jaws of holy war, their story still ends the same way, with silence. You look down now at your own feet, boots dry and clean, and imagine what it must have felt like to walk barefoot across a continent, chasing a miracle that was never coming. Not everyone who sets out to save the world comes home a hero. Some never come home at all. You've lost your way in the forest. Not a modern forest, no trail markers, no helpful ranger stations, no cell service. Just dark, tangled woods where the trees seem to lean inward like gossiping villagers. You hear something, twigs snapping behind you, breathing that doesn't match your own, the distinct sound of claws dragging across bark. Then the howl comes. Welcome to Poligny, eastern France, circa 1521, where people don't just fear wolves, they fear werewolves. And tonight, someone is on trial for being one. You slip into the packed courtroom, really more of a cold stone hall that smells like smoke and mildew. Townspeople cram in shoulder to shoulder. They whisper the name Gilles Garnier, the hermit of Saint-Bonneau. Strange, reclusive, hairy, now accused of lycanthropy and murder. You try to get a good look at him, but he's hunched low in the dock, a mangled shape of matted hair and sharp, darting eyes. He looks more like a beaten man than a beast. But that doesn't matter to this crowd. They've seen him, they say. Here's your historical fact. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, hundreds of people across Europe were tried for being werewolves. France had some of the most famous cases, especially in the region of Franche-Comté. This wasn't just folklore. It was taken seriously. Lycanthropy appeared in legal documents. Confessions were recorded. Executions were carried out. And Garnier. His case is one of the most infamous. In 1572, children began disappearing from the forests outside Poligny. Their remains were found days later, partially eaten, throats torn out. bones gnawed. Witnesses claim to have seen a giant wolf dragging bodies through the underbrush. But when the wolf ran, it sometimes looked too upright, too aware. Soon rumors settled on Garnier. He lived on the edge of town, married poor, known to wander at night. Eventually he was arrested, and that's when things took a darker turn. Under torture, because of course Garnier confessed. He claimed he'd been visited by a spectral figure, possibly the devil, who gave him a magical ointment that allowed him to transform into a wolf. He described the process in disturbing detail, his limbs elongating his mind, shifting his hunger, becoming inhuman. He confessed to killing and eating at least 4 children. You can't look away. Here's your quirky tidbit: medieval werewolf ointments were a thing. Recipes appear in grimoires containing belladonna, henbane, opium, and fat. Not the kind of stuff you rub on for dry skin. These potions caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes psychosis. People believed they were changing, their minds twisted enough to match the myth. And that's one theory, that Garnier was mentally ill or poisoned, or both. But the trial records don't care about nuance. They're just pages soaked in confession and fear. Historians still argue whether Garnier actually committed the murders or simply believed he had. After all, people can be convinced they've done monstrous things. Under torture, especially, reality bends. But the villagers, they needed a wolf. And Garnier fit the shape. He was burned at the stake. The details of the execution are scarce, but you can guess. Fire smoke a crowd that needed to believe justice had been done, that the woods were safe again. But they weren't. Because just months later, another man, Pierre Burgot, was tried for lycanthropy in nearby Besançon. He claimed he also had a pact with the devil, also used an ointment, also prowled in fur under moonlight. Coincidence or contagion? You hear a theory whispered behind you that lycanthropy trials were just another flavor of witch trials, social purges disguised as spiritual warfare. But others say something else entirely, that real serial killers, the ones we only started naming centuries later, existed even then. And that the only shape the medieval mind had for them was the wolf. Because what else could explain the cruelty, the mutilation, the hunger? The medieval world was full of dangers: disease, war, starvation. But intentional violence, especially toward children, was something else. Something that needed a supernatural explanation. Better to believe in werewolves than in evil humans. And as you leave the courtroom, the scent of ash still clinging to your cloak, you notice the woods again. Still dark, still quiet. You remember that Garnier confessed to eating the flesh raw. He said it tasted better than anything cooked. Whether that was madness or theater, you'll never know. But it makes you hesitate when you hear another twig snap behind you. Because maybe Garnier was a liar. Maybe he was sick. Or maybe he wasn't the only one. The fire crackles in the courtyard. You can smell the wood smoke, but underneath it something sharper. Flesh, hair, oil. A crown of soot rises into the sky as armored guards turn their faces away, not out of mercy, but fear. Fear of a dying man's curse. The year is 1314. You're in Paris, outside the gates of the Ile de la Cité. A pyre has been built by royal order. A once powerful man is chained to it. His name, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. And as the flames lick up his legs, he doesn't scream for God. He curses the king. Tonight, you witness a dark intersection of power, greed, and supernatural paranoia, the Templar curse and the suspicious deaths that followed. But first, rewind. The Knights Templar began as a religious military order in the 12th century, protecting pilgrims to the Holy Land. Over 2 centuries, they became wealthy, influential, and terrifyingly independent. They owned land across Europe. They ran their own banking system. Kings owed them money, and that, as you might guess, is where the trouble started. Your mainstream historical fact: in 1307, King Philip IV of France, deep in debt and hungry for control, ordered a mass arrest of the Templars. Dozens were seized on Friday the 13th. Yes, that's where it comes from. The charges: heresy, idolatry, sorcery, spitting on the cross, worshipping a severed head called Baphomet. Were these accusations true? Almost certainly not. Most were extracted under torture. Templars confessed to anything after being crushed, burned, stretched, and bled. Still, the Church was complicit. Pope Clement V, under pressure from Philip, dissolved the order in 1312. Their property was seized, their leaders imprisoned. But de Molay didn't go quietly. After years in chains, he was finally sentenced to death by fire, an unusual punishment for a knight and religious figure. Usually they'd get a beheading, something quick. But Philip wanted a message, something public, something final. And that's when the Grand Master, bound to the stake, shouted his final words, not a prayer, but a curse. He declared that Philip IV and Pope Clement V would both be called before God's judgment within a year. He also called down a curse on the king's lineage. You can still hear the words in the smoke. Here's your quirky detail: Philip reportedly twitched at the mention of his name. Some say he tried to leave the square before the fire took hold. Superstition runs deep even in kings. What happened next? That's where it gets weird. Pope Clement V died 1 month later, reportedly of a sudden illness, possibly dysentery. His body was placed in a church for viewing where the building caught fire, and partially cremated his corpse. King Philip IV followed 8 months later, felled by a sudden stroke while hunting. He died at age 46. Healthy, active, and then gone. Coincidence, maybe. Historians still argue whether the cursed deaths were just poetic timing, convenient storytelling, or the result of medieval stress and terrible diets. But the real nightmare came after. Within 14 years, all 3 of Philip's sons, Louis Philippe and Charles, became kings of France. All 3 died without male heirs. The Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for 3 centuries, collapsed. Enter the 100 Years' War, sparked in part by this succession crisis. Was that part of the curse too? You walk the halls of the Louvre. Now, not the museum, but the old palace that stood before it. You can almost hear the whispers of courtiers, terrified of the ghost of the Templar Grand Master. Some reportedly avoided saying his name. Others lit candles in secret, hoping to appease whatever was still angry. Of course, the Templars never truly vanished. The land was divided, the name changed, but many former knights joined other orders or went underground. And centuries later, the myths exploded. Freemasons, secret societies, buried treasure, the Holy Grail. Every conspiracy theorist's starter pack begins with the Templars. But for you, the story is simpler. You were there at the burning. You heard the words, and now you wonder whether a dying man's fury could echo through a century of blood and flame. Because sometimes curses don't need magic. Sometimes they just need timing. The field is quiet, too quiet. You step across brittle stalks of wheat, each one frozen and crisp beneath your feet. The smell of death is in the air, but not from people, not this time. It comes from above. You look up, not a single bird in sight. You're in the year 1320, somewhere near the southern Rhine, and the ground is carpeted with feathers, bones, and tiny stiffened wings. Dead starlings, crows, gulls, even doves litter the countryside like a plague has fallen from the sky. It isn't war. It isn't disease. At least, not the kind that lives on Earth. Tonight, we're unraveling the mystery of the mass bird deaths of 1320, an eerie, half-documented event that's been described as omen punishment, natural disaster, and possibly something much stranger. The first reports come from German-speaking regions. Shepherds and villagers start finding birds by the dozens, then by the hundreds lying in open fields. No wounds, no blood. Just dead. The flocks that normally blacken the skies during spring migrations are suddenly silent, and then it spreads. Chronicles mention the phenomenon in parts of Bohemia, the Low Countries, and even northern France. One monk near Ghent writes that the sky wept black feathers for days. And another more dramatically claims that the very angels cast the birds down for they flew too near heaven. You can practically hear the medieval panic setting in. Here's your mainstream historical fact in the Middle Ages. Birds were seen not only as animals, but as messengers of God, of fate, of plague. Entire sermons were built around the behavior of swans, ravens, and doves. So when birds started falling from the sky, it wasn't just sad, it was apocalyptic. Of course, modern minds have tried to explain it. Historians still argue whether the bird deaths of 1320 were the result of an environmental shift, possibly a sharp, cold snap, toxic gas release, or some kind of avian disease that swept through tightly packed migratory routes. Others suspect a violent storm, a bird blitz, rare but real phenomena, where sudden hail lightning or sharp pressure changes kill birds in midair. Imagine flying into a wall of freezing air so fast your wings lock up and you plummet. Still others blame volcanic activity. There's evidence that a massive undersea volcanic event occurred earlier that decade, and while it didn't make the headlines, since no printing press, the gases released could have affected high-altitude air quality across the region. But that's the thing, none of the records mention any storms, or fire, or thunder. Just birds falling. And then for months afterward, more strange signs: cows refusing to graze, dogs howling at midday, a blood moon that lingered too long over eastern cities, and a glowing cross in the night sky spotted by multiple chroniclers in France and Bavaria. Here's your quirky tidbit. One village in Thuringia reportedly held a funeral for the birds, digging a mass grave, lining it with rosemary, and praying for their souls just in case the creatures had been possessed. You can't make this stuff up. Well, someone probably did. But still, the question no one could answer: why birds? Why now? Some whispered that the world was warning them, that the birds had flown too high, seen something in the heavens they weren't meant to see, and been cast down. Others said it was divine punishment, a precursor to something worse. Spoiler alert. 2 decades later, the Black Death hit. Did the mass bird deaths foreshadow it? Maybe not directly, but to the medieval mind, the connection would have been crystal clear. Nature was breaking. The animals were fleeing or falling. So where does that leave you? You're standing now in a field thick with feathers. The wind kicks one into your face and you brush it away, but not before noticing its stain. Not red, not brown, but black. Not ink black, not soot, something deeper, like it absorbed the sky itself. You find an old man collecting the bodies in a basket. He hums a hymn, something in Latin. He doesn't meet your gaze. "What are you doing?" you ask. He shrugs. "Cleaning up the mess," he says. Like we always do, and you realize to him this isn't a horror. It's just history. Because the strange thing isn't that the birds died. It's that we forgot. No epic poems, no monuments, just a few lines in monkish chronicles, scattered and vague, as if someone or something wanted it brushed aside, minimized. buried like the birds themselves. So tonight, when you see a flock of starlings carve ribbons across the twilight, take a moment. Watch closely. Count how many return. And if they don't, maybe something old is stirring again. You've made your way to the edge of a battlefield, but this time the fight is over. The air is heavy with the scent of blood iron and churned earth. Shouts have faded into moans. Here and there you see makeshift surgeons bent over wounded men sewing flesh with thick, uneven thread. Then you see it. One soldier's wound is glowing. Faint blue light, barely visible but unmistakable. His chest gash pulses with a ghostly shimmer like cold starlight trapped beneath his skin. The surgeons freeze. You step closer. The glow isn't fire, and it isn't a trick of the eye. Welcome to Shiloh, Tennessee, 1862. Yes, not the Middle Ages, but stay with me. Because long before this Civil War battlefield gained its eerie nickname, stories of glowing wounds were whispered across European fields of medieval slaughter. And tonight, we're peeling back the bandages on one of history's strangest medical mysteries, the battlefield wounds that glowed and healed. The story of Shiloh is the most famous case where some wounded soldiers claimed their injuries glowed in the dark, and those were the wounds that didn't get infected. But earlier, less documented accounts go much further back. Agincourt Crécy even whispered rumors from the Crusades. The glow was often seen at night after the battle, and some said it was the work of saints or angels, or the holy blood of martyrs leaking into the soil. Others blamed forest spirits, fairies, or pagan hexes. Some even claimed the glow appeared only on those destined to survive. Back then, no one called it science. But now we know something they didn't. Here's your mainstream fact: in the early 2000s, microbiologists finally connected the dots. Two high school students, because of course working on a science project with NASA-level curiosity, discovered that a species of bacteria called Photohabdus luminescens emits a faint blue light, and more importantly, kills off competing microbes. In other words, it disinfects wounds. This bacterium lives in nematodes, tiny worms that reside in soil. And during certain conditions, wet, muddy fields like a torn-up battlefield, they can infect open wounds. If you're lucky, they do their job without killing you. And if you're really lucky, they glow. So yes, the blue glow may have been a symbiotic bacterial miracle, a primitive antibiotic before antibiotics were even a word. Historians still argue whether this explains all accounts of glowing wounds. After all, medieval battlefields weren't exactly hygienic wonderlands, and accurate record-keeping wasn't high on the to-do list. Many descriptions are secondhand, vague, or steeped in religious language. But that's the part that fascinates you, because medieval Europe had no idea what bacteria were. No germ theory, no microscopes. And yet, they saw it, described it, named it. In Latin, Ignis Dei, the fire of God. Here's your quirky tidbit: some knights believed glowing wounds meant you'd been touched by a divine spirit in battle. They would cut open old scars just to see if the glow would return. Spoiler, it didn't. Usually they just got infected. Others collected the blood-soaked bandages and buried them in churchyards. A few turned them into relics, because if the wound glowed, surely the blood inside was holy. But not everyone saw it as a blessing. In parts of Eastern Europe, blue light leaking from a wound was seen as a sign of unnatural resurrection, a body that refused to die properly. Soldiers who glowed too brightly were sometimes helped along by their comrades. You take another step onto the field. Your boots squish in the soaked dirt. You wonder how many soldiers crawled through this muck, bleeding and shivering, unaware that their survival might come not from prayers or potions, but from glowing worms in the soil. It's a little beautiful and a little horrifying. Because if it's true, if this bacteria really did save lives, then thousands of warriors across centuries may have owed their survival to something they thought was magic. Something hiding in the dirt. Waiting. Watching. Helping. Maybe you kneel now beside a broken sword. Its blade catches the fading light, and for a moment you see a faint glimmer on a nearby stone. Not quite a glow, just a suggestion. You lean in, touch the stone. It's warm. You lift your fingers to your eyes. Nothing. But maybe you just missed it. So here's the question that hangs in the air: how many miracles were just science without context? How many divine signs were really just natural wonders in disguise? And how many still go unnoticed, glowing faintly just out of sight? You approach the well slowly, eyes squinting in the mid-morning haze. It should be a source of life, fresh, clean, cool. Instead, it's cordoned off with rope marked with chalk symbols you don't recognize, and surrounded by farmers holding pitchforks like they're expecting something to crawl out. No one draws water from it anymore. No one even gets close. Because they say there's something down there. A basilisk. And not just any basilisk, the Basiliscus vulgaris as described by medieval bestiaries, half snake, half rooster, born from a serpent's egg hatched by a toad beneath the sun of a cursed day. One glance from it, they say, and you die. Instantly, dramatically, sometimes exploding, depending on the storyteller. Tonight you peer into the dark, fetid world of medieval monster logic, where water wells were blamed for plagues, and the creatures living in them were anything but imaginary. Here's your historical fact. During the Middle Ages, many outbreaks of disease, especially in tightly packed towns, were blamed on tainted wells, and for good reason. Wells were often shallow, shared, and positioned disturbingly close to latrines, animal pens, and waste dumps. Add in poor sanitation and a heat wave, and voila, you get dysentery, cholera, typhoid, or what they'd simply call death. But the explanations people reached for weren't microbial. They were mythical. Enter the basilisk. You've probably seen the word pop up in fantasy fiction. Harry Potter fans, hello, but the creature's roots are much older. The earliest accounts go back to Roman times, but it flourished in medieval Europe, where the fear of invisible killers, plague, poison demons needed physical faces. And nothing embodied silent death like the basilisk. It lived in wells and caves and cracks beneath the floor. Its breath could wilt crops. Its gaze could kill men. In some versions, its skin leaked venom, killing anything it touched. One bishop claimed it could even poison the very air, a medieval attempt at explaining mass death with style. And what better place for such a monster than your village water supply? Wells were already terrifying. They were dark, deep, and often carried strange smells. Throw in a few deaths, someone drops dead near the bucket. A string of livestock start foaming at the mouth, and before long, everyone's whispering that something lives down there. Sometimes it wasn't just whispers. There are records, real ones, of wells being sealed off, covered in blessed cloths, guarded by armed men. Not to protect the water, but to keep the creature in. In Bohemia, one well was bricked over entirely after 3 villagers collapsed near it with no wounds. The priest who oversaw the sealing said they were killed by the devil's shadow. In other words, basilisk. Here's your quirky tidbit. One method for slaying a basilisk, according to several medieval texts, was to lower a mirror into its lair. The beast, upon seeing its own reflection, would be instantly destroyed. This actually led to a few extremely brave or extremely expendable villagers being lowered into wells, carrying polished metal plates like makeshift riot shields. Results mixed. You lean over the well's edge, now peering into the void. There's nothing but damp air and echo. But the villagers aren't convinced. They say a man named Elias went down there once just to clean debris. Came back up pale, shaking, and blind in one eye. Never spoke again. Died in his sleep a week later. They buried him in silence. No one fetched water since. The church didn't exactly help the situation. They often encouraged belief in the basilisk, not because they thought it was real, but because it kept people cautious. Easier to blame a mythical beast than explain waterborne disease to a barely literate population. And let's be honest, the devil lives in the well sounds a lot more effective than please boil your water. Historians still argue whether the basilisk myth originated as disease metaphor or grew from earlier serpent legends in desert cultures. Either way, it slithered into the European imagination and never really left. In Poland, one basilisk was said to live in a cellar rather than a well, turning would-be burglars to stone. A girl reportedly killed it by sneaking down with a basket of mirrors, which may be history's first recorded boss battle tactic. But back to your well. The villagers want to destroy it. Salt the ground. Move the entire village if they have to. One man swears he heard hissing last night, and another claims a goat refused to drink from the bucket. You hear something too. Faint, like breath rising from below. Maybe it's wind. Maybe. You step back, and you start to understand the basilisk isn't just a monster. It's a placeholder, a terrifying label for things they couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't fight. You can't punch cholera, but you can seal a well. So next time you drink from a tap or sip from a bottle, remember the water used to come from places like this. Black, mysterious places. And when the sickness came, the fear followed. They didn't blame bad plumbing. They blamed what lived beneath. The chapel is small, hushed, and heavy with the scent of old stone and melted wax. A single shaft of light cuts through the stained glass, spilling onto a wooden pedestal. On it stands a statue of the Virgin Mary, robed, crowned, serene. But her skin is pitch black, not dark brown, not weathered. Black. You're standing before one of the many black Madonnas of medieval Europe, mysterious, deeply venerated, and utterly baffling to modern eyes. There are hundreds scattered across France, Spain, Italy, and beyond. Some sit in remote mountain shrines. Others occupy prime real estate in Gothic cathedrals, and no one agrees why they're black. Tonight, we step into the soot-streaked mystery of these strange icons, their origins, their power, and the unsettling truth that the church team never fully explained them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. At least 400 Black Madonna statues and paintings have been catalogued across Europe, with the highest concentration in France. Many date back to the 11th to 13th centuries, though some claim earlier origins. The most famous include Our Lady of Montserrat in Spain and Notre Dame de Rocamadour in France. They often depict Mary and the infant Christ in Byzantine-style poses, seated solemn holding divine court. But unlike the pale rose-cheeked Madonnas we see in Renaissance art, these figures have charcoal black skin, stark against golden halos and jeweled robes. And they were and still are fiercely venerated. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to kneel before them. Miracles were attributed to their presence. Crutches, rings, and weeping letters line their altars like offerings to a living deity. But why the color? Some say smoke. Centuries of candles, soot, incense, and oil lamps gradually darkened the faces of white statues. It sounds plausible until you notice that only the skin is black. The robes stay gold. The lips stay red. The halos stay untouched. Others suggest deliberate artistry, that these Madonnas were made black from the beginning, possibly reflecting an older iconography from Egyptian or Eastern Christian traditions, where darker skin was associated with mystery, wisdom, or divine motherhood. but no one knows for sure. Historians still argue whether the Black Madonnas were created as local expressions of devotion, remnants of pre-Christian goddesses absorbed into Catholicism, or subtle acts of resistance by marginalized groups. Some believe they were meant to embody the mystical aspect of Mary, less motherly, more oracular, the Madonna of the cave, the hidden queen. And then there are the fringe theories. You hear one whispered by a monk as he sweeps the chapel floor, that these statues preserve the memory of a dark-skinned Mary, a Mary erased by later art and politics. That early Christians, especially in Africa and the Middle East, worshipped a non-European Madonna, and these icons are the surviving truth. You watch as an elderly woman lights a candle before the statue. She doesn't question the color. She bows her head, kisses her thumb, and presses it to the base of the pedestal. To her, this is just Mary. Here's your quirky detail in Le Puy-en-Velay, France. The Black Madonna is believed to change the weather. Pilgrims pray to her for rain, and legend says that if she's displeased, she'll bring storms. Her statue was paraded through the streets during droughts. Once, when she was dropped by accident, a flash flood hit the town within hours. Coincidence, maybe, but maybe not. During the Reformation, many of the Black Madonnas were destroyed or painted over. Protestant reformers saw them as too pagan, too sensual, too strange. The Catholic Church, during the Counter-Reformation, doubled down on promoting the pale, blue-cloaked version of Mary we know today. But some survived. In Częstochowa, Poland, the Black Madonna of Jasna Góra remains one of the most venerated icons in Europe. She has scars, 2 diagonal slashes across her cheek, said to have been inflicted by Hussite raiders. No amount of restoration can make them disappear. They've tried. She bleeds. She stays black. And she draws millions of pilgrims every year. You lean in closer now to the statue before you. Her eyes are dark, almost invisible in the candlelight. There's no smile, no gentle tilt of the head, just a deep maternal stillness that feels both comforting and unnerving. She's not a mother who soothes. She's a mother who watches. Some say her color connects her to the earth, others to the night sky, but some say it's ash remnants of burning, that she survived some holy fire and came out blackened but whole. And others, well, they say she's remembering something we have forgotten, a time before cathedrals, before parchment, before pale saints in gold frames. You glance over your shoulder. The chapel is empty, just you and her. And in that moment, you understand she doesn't explain herself. She doesn't need to. Your breath fogs the visor of your helmet. You're soaked in blood, some of it yours, most of it not. You've been stabbed, crushed, and thrown from your horse. There's a splinter of wood in your ribs, and you are still standing. You should be dead, but you're not. Because you're Sir Guillaume de Montferrat, and you have a reputation now, the knight who refused to die. The battlefield stinks of iron and bile. You limp through it like a revenant sword, dragging behind you armor dented like a kicked-in pot. The archers saw you fall. The infantry swears they saw your neck broken beneath a flail. And yet here you are. The whispers start before the crows finish their meal. He can't die, they say. He made a pact, they say. He's a ghost in steel. And thus begins the myth. Tonight, we enter the murky world of unkillable knights, real medieval warriors, whose tenacity, trauma, and sheer refusal to drop dead earned them a place somewhere between man and monster. Here's your mainstream fact: while chivalry jousts and tournaments paint a romantic picture of knighthood, real medieval combat was brutal, savage, and utterly unforgiving. Knights who survived multiple major battles became legendary, not because of invincibility, but because most didn't live long enough to get famous. So when one did, it felt unnatural. Sir Guillaume isn't the only one. Consider John Chandos, the English knight and right-hand man to the Black Prince. He was ambushed, stabbed in the face, lost an eye, and kept fighting. Or Bertrand du Guesclin, the Breton warlord, who reportedly escaped death 7 times, including from poisoning, drowning, and a siege where he was buried alive in rubble. In stories, they never die properly, just stop appearing. But back to Guillaume. His tale appears in fragments, a passing mention in the Chroniques de Gâtinais, a battle poem written 50 years after his death, or supposed death, and one bizarre relic, a blood-stained surcoat housed in a church crypt in central France tagged simply Le Survivant. That's it. No dates, no noble lineage, just a name and a question. How many times can a man survive before people stop calling it luck? Historians still argue whether Guillaume was real or a composite character stitched together from multiple wounded knights, each too stubborn to fall. But the legend grew he was said to have survived. A boar hunt gone wrong where he took a tusk to the chest. A siege where he fell from the ramparts, broke both legs and crawled for 2 miles. A duel where he took a spear to the throat and won anyway. Then the pièce de résistance, the Battle of Cazeneuve, where he was supposedly buried in a mass grave, only to walk into the village 2 days later, caked in dirt, asking for bread. And that's when the stories changed. Here's your quirky tidbit: his enemies started carrying silver blades. Not for show, for protection. Because someone whispered he was a revenant, an undead. A knight cursed to walk until his sins were paid in blood. In Eastern Europe, they'd have called him a strigoi. In France, just a man too dangerous to leave unfinished. He wasn't just unkillable, he was unforgivable. But maybe there's a simpler answer. You see, battlefield medicine in the 13th century was inconsistent. A knight presumed dead could just be mostly dead, passed out. Bleeding, yes, but not beyond saving. And if you had strong lungs, a thick skull, and someone willing to sew you up with horsehair, you might walk again. You might fight again. You might become something they tell stories about. And trauma makes men silent. Half the knights in the rolls came back from crusades and never spoke again. PTSD wasn't diagnosed then. It was just called grimness, or God's weight. Guillaume didn't boast, didn't write memoirs. He just kept showing up where he shouldn't. And when he finally disappeared, no grave, no tombstone, people said he wandered into the Pyrenees and vanished. Maybe he died. Maybe not. Maybe he became something else entirely. The church tried to claim him in death. Some called him blessed. Others said cursed. A monk in Toulouse insisted Guillaume had made a vow to fight until he'd personally vanquished 100 men. A holy quest. He lost count at 87. You stand now at an old battlefield, wind slicing through the grass. Somewhere beneath your boots are bones, most of them broken, some of them buried with armor still on. You wonder if his are here too, or if he walked away again. And here's the thought that chills your blood a little. Maybe he didn't survive because he was strong. Maybe he survived because something else wanted him to. Something that needed him to keep killing. After all, the legends don't call him a saint. They call him the knight who refused to die. And no one said he was on our side. He walks into the ballroom without a wrinkle in his coat or a gray in his hair. He knows your name, but you don't know his. He dances like a man born in candlelight, speaks a dozen languages, recites Latin backward for fun, never eats in public, never ages. They call him the Count of Saint-Germain. And you're about to meet the man history couldn't pin down and time refused to age. Tonight we trace the impossible trail of one of Europe's most unexplainable aristocrats, a man whose documented life spans decades, whose death is unconfirmed, and whose legend has only grown stranger with every century. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The real Count of Saint-Germain was a European courtier in the 18th century, known for his wit, music, and apparent wealth. He played the violin, painted beautifully, mingled with kings, and was known as the Wonder Man by Voltaire himself. Voltaire, not easily impressed. First confirmed appearance around 1740, though some claim to have met him in the 1690s. He looks the same, and that's where it begins. In Paris, London, Vienna. The Hague, he is always the mysterious guest. He never reveals his birthplace, speaks with no accent, dresses slightly out of fashion, but always impeccably. Rumors swirl that he doesn't sleep, that he lives on oatmeal, that he remembers things no man should. One court lady insists she met him 40 years apart and he hadn't changed. Saint-Germain himself once joked that he was over 500 years old, that he'd been present at the wedding in Cana, that he dined with Plato. Everyone laughed, and then went very, very quiet. You sip wine in the corner and watch him work the room. There's a slyness to his smile, like he knows the punchline to a joke the rest of you haven't heard yet. Your companion mutters, "He's not real." But he is. He's always been. He pops up in Frederick the Great's court in the 1750s, then again in Versailles, then Russia, England. One ambassador calls him the man who knows everything and nothing at once. No one sees him age. No one sees him eat. No one sees him leave. And then suddenly, in 1784, he dies, or so they say. He reportedly passes away in the home of Prince Charles of Hesse Castle in Germany. There's a gravestone, a death certificate, an estate. Case closed, right? Well, here's your quirky detail. He keeps showing up after he dies. 1785 Germany, reportedly seen at a Masonic conference. 1789 France, allegedly meets with Marie Antoinette in secret, warning her of the revolution. 1821 Italy. Witnesses claim he was in Milan under the name Major Fraser, looking suspiciously unchanged. 1860s India. A British officer records a man of learning and manners in Delhi who called himself Saint-Germain. Historians still argue whether these were imposters, cult leaders, or just rich eccentrics co-opting the name. But the pattern is too consistent, too deliberate. Then the theosophists get involved. In the 19th century, occult societies adopt Saint-Germain as a master of wisdom, a semi-immortal, quasi-divine teacher who guides humanity from behind the scenes. He's called the Ascended Master. Some even believe he lives in Shambhala, a mythical city in the Himalayas, sipping eternal tea and watching civilization evolve. You're not sure whether to roll your eyes or build a shrine. One fringe theory claims he was Sir Francis Bacon in a previous life. Another says he's not a man at all, but a timeless being, a human consciousness freed from the cycle of birth and death. Some link him to the Philosopher's Stone, others to the Holy Grail. But here's the part that always returns like an echo: he never died. Every few decades, another photograph surfaces. Another traveler recounts a strange conversation with a gentleman who seemed too refined, too well-versed in history, who smiled a little too knowingly when the subject of time came up. You return now to the ballroom. The music is soft, a waltz. Candles flicker in their sconces. And across the room, the Count of Saint-Germain raises his glass to you, as if you've just been let in on something. You blink. He's gone. Of course he is. But if you listen closely, you'll hear it again. That whispered promise spoken by a man who never dies. I was there. I remember. I always will. You're deep inside a cathedral, cool, shadowed, silent. Your boots echo off ancient marble as you follow a monk with a candle and a bundle of keys. He unlocks a heavy iron door, pushes it open with a grunt, and gestures you forward. Inside, you find a heart. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. A real one, wrapped in silk, preserved in a box of silver and glass, resting atop velvet like a jewel. It's the mummified heart of King Louis IX, and tonight it's going to teach you how the Middle Ages handled death devotion and the strange idea that sometimes the holiest thing about a king is the part inside him. Louis IX of France, Saint Louis to his fans, died in 1270 on his second crusade, not with a sword in hand, but with dysentery in Tunisia. Not a very saintly exit. But he'd done enough beforehand to qualify for a fast-track canonization. He was pious, zealous, and fanatically devoted to relics. He built Sainte-Chapelle just to house a fragment of the crown of thorns. He also launched crusades, punished heretics, and wore a hair shirt beneath his robes. So naturally, when he died, his body was chopped up. In a holy way. Here's your mainstream historical fact: in the Middle Ages, royal and saintly bodies were frequently disarticulated, cut into pieces so different parts could be buried in different locations. This wasn't just morbid, it was a form of spiritual logistics. The king's body could be buried in one place, his heart in another, and his entrails in a third. More shrines, more relics, more pilgrims, more income. It's called mos teutonicus, the German custom, and Louis got the full treatment. His heart, according to tradition, was extracted, preserved in aromatic wine and herbs wrapped in linen, and sent to Montreal Cathedral in Sicily. Why Sicily? Politics, mostly. His brother Charles was king of Sicily at the time. What's more intimate than sending someone your mummified ventricles, and here it remains, or so they say, because the heart was moved, lost, recovered, lost again. Some say what's currently on display is a replica. Others insist the real heart is buried somewhere under Notre Dame, quietly pulsing with divine resonance. You ask the monk beside you how it's been preserved so well. He shrugs. Vinegar, he says, and grace. But this isn't just about Louis. Other royal hearts had their own afterlives. Richard, the Lionheart's heart, was embalmed separately and buried at Rouen Cathedral, even though his body lies elsewhere. Anne of Brittany had her heart placed in a gold reliquary shaped like a scallop shell, engraved with prayers, and sent back to her homeland. Henry I of England had his organs buried in Rouen, his body in Reading, and according to rumor, his brain sent to Winchester. Medieval rulers had more geography in death than most people had in life. Here's your quirky tidbit. When one bishop died in the 13th century, he requested his heart be buried beneath the altar of a poor chapel where he once preached, but his body went to a cathedral. His logic: let my heart stay where it beat truest. Oh, morbidly romantic. Back to Louis. His heart became more than a relic. It became political currency. Montreal Cathedral used it to draw pilgrims. Kings made oaths beside it. During the Napoleonic Wars, the heart was reportedly smuggled out to prevent desecration. And in 2019, yes, recently, a group of church officials in Palermo announced they had rediscovered the relic in a sealed reliquary. It was very dry, and yet curiously intact. Historians still argue whether the object is genuine. Carbon dating is inconclusive. The church won't let it be dissected, can't imagine why. So the heart sits silent, shriveled, and surrounded by prayer. But you can't help wondering why the heart, not the head, not the hands, Not the sword arm that built an empire, but this muscle, this private fleshy drum sealed in silver like a secret. Because in the medieval imagination, the heart was everything. The seat of love, the vault of memory, the location of the soul. Even today, we talk about people who are all heart. We draw it on Valentine's. We clutch our chest when things hurt. Not our brain, not our lungs. The heart feels like the thing that makes us us. And when someone like Louis IX dies part king, part saint, it makes sense that people wanted his heart to keep beating metaphorically, to be close to it, to pray to it, to carry a piece of him across the continent like a divine cargo. You step forward alone now and look down through the glass at the desiccated muscle curled in its velvet cradle. It looks small, shrink-wrapped, unimpressive. But something about it lingers. A warmth, a pull, a pressure in your own chest. And you understand, if only for a moment, why people believed in relics. Because belief doesn't come from what a thing is. It comes from what it meant to someone who loved it. Even if it's a dried-up 6th century-old lump of king meat in a silver box. The wine is dark, too dark. It tastes like fire clove and some strange metal you can't name. You feel it slide down your throat like a secret, and for a second, everything in the candle-lit chamber goes quiet. Your vision sharpens. The laughter around you turns sour. You're at a party, but not the kind with polite conversation and 7-course feasts. This is the Hellfire Club, and tonight, the devil is on the guest list. You're in 18th century England now, or maybe Ireland, depending on which chapter of this story you've fallen into, and the moon is high over a ruined abbey, or a limestone cave, or a stately home with the curtains drawn tight. The rules are simple: no daylight, no morals, no mercy. Tonight we descend into the debauched, wine-drenched world of aristocratic occultism, where the line between satire, sin, and straight-up Satan gets very blurry. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The original Hellfire Club was founded in early 18th century London by Philip Wharton, a noble rake and a man who could probably drink Satan under the table. His club was more parody than heresy. They mocked religion, feasted on forbidden meat during Lent, and held meetings dressed as monks, complete with faux sermons, blasphemous toasts, and theatrical rituals. But that was just the opening act. The more infamous version came later under the eye of Sir Francis Dashwood, a politician who wore powdered wigs by day and priestly robes by torchlight. His Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wykeham met at Medmenham Abbey, a former Cistercian monastery turned ritual playground. Their motto, Fais ce que tu voudras, do what thou wilt. That should sound familiar. A few centuries later, Aleister Crowley would adopt it too. The abbey was remodeled into a den of erotic frescoes, secret chambers, and mirrored ceilings. Think Roman temple meets gentleman's club, add some goats, and an uncomfortable number of masks. Women, often referred to as nuns, attended. Their identities were unrecorded intentionally. Some were mistresses of lords. Others were actresses or servants or courtesans in disguise. The point was anonymity, freedom, and a lack of consequence. Until people started dying. Here's your quirky tidbit. Dashwood later expanded operations to the West Wykeham Caves, a series of man-made tunnels supposedly designed for agricultural storage. They led deep into the chalky hills, past chambers with names like the Hall of Venus and the Inner Temple, and finally ended at a central chamber shaped like a pentagram. No one stored wheat down there. Members included future Prime Minister John Wilkes, radical thinkers, earls, judges, men who sat in Parliament by day and drank out of human skulls by night. That part. Not an exaggeration, one of their favorite toasting cups was a silver-lined skull, possibly real, possibly symbolic, probably both. And then there were the rumors that black masses were performed by candlelight, that effigies were burned not just of kings, but of bishops, that members made oaths in blood, that real satanic invocations were attempted, that something once answered. Historians still argue whether the Hellfire Club was a genuine occult society or just a fraternity of bored rich men LARPing heresy for the thrill. Evidence exists on both sides. Surviving letters hint at secret rites, but also make jokes about the devil's table manners. Diaries alternate between terror and farce. But people went missing. Servants disappeared. One member reportedly took his own life after claiming he'd seen something in the caves. Another Lord Sandwich, yes, that Lord Sandwich supposedly tried to summon a demon and went temporarily blind. And then there's Paul Whitehead, the club's secretary, whose heart was removed at death and kept in an urn at West Wycombe for decades. It was stolen in the 1800s, never recovered. When asked why he wanted his heart preserved, Whitehead reportedly said, "So I can hear the rites continue." No one laughed. Over time, the Hellfire Club faded. Medmenham fell into ruin. The caves collapsed and were later reopened as a tourist attraction, complete with spooky lighting and slightly sanitized signage. But some say it never really ended, that the club still meets under a different name in different robes in a room with no mirrors. And what did they believe really? Maybe nothing. Or maybe they believed the greatest sin wasn't blasphemy. It was boredom. The kind of boredom only power breeds the arrogance of men who think they've conquered everything and now want to test whether they can also conquer hell. You reach the bottom of the cave now. The stone is slick beneath your feet. In the flickering torchlight, you see a table carved into the rock. A goblet, a feather, a dagger. A single black candle still burns. And behind you, just for a moment, you swear you hear the tail end of a toast echoing through the tunnel to sin without punishment, to truth without mercy, and to the devil who takes no sides. Then silence, the kind that waits for someone to answer. The sky is wrong tonight. You don't know why. Maybe it's the stillness. Maybe it's the way the stars seem to hold their breath. The village is asleep, shutters closed, candles snuffed. And then suddenly, from the heavens, a low metallic moan. Not thunder, not wind. A sound like brass horns, distant and layered, rising and falling, like a breath from a sleeping giant. You stare up your chest tight. There are no clouds, no lightning. But something is calling. Welcome to one of the most eerie, underexplained phenomena of the medieval world, what modern scholars now refer to as the sky trumpets. A mystery that spans continents, centuries, and belief systems. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was something divine, or apocalyptic, or both. And tonight, it's above you. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval chronicles across Europe contain multiple accounts of strange, trumpet-like noises from the sky unaccompanied by storms or battles. Monks in cloisters, shepherds in fields, merchants on roads. The witnesses varied, but the description stayed the same. A deep, droning blast often heard at twilight or just before sunrise. Sometimes it came in pulses. Sometimes it lasted hours. Always from nowhere. In 1290, a chronicler in Ghent described a trumpet in the heavens that woke the dead and frightened beasts. In 1317, near Avignon, French peasants claimed to hear heavenly music without source. In 1386, Bohemian soldiers halted their march at the sound of angelic horns. Not everyone agreed what it meant. Some said it was Gabriel's horn signaling the end times. Others thought it was an omen of plague. Still others blamed demons testing their songs before the Last Judgment. But some listened harder and heard patterns, rhythms, sequences, even messages. Historians still argue whether these reports were early interpretations of natural atmospheric phenomena, auroras, shifting jet streams, or acoustic reverberations from distant earthquakes. There's some precedent under rare conditions. Sounds can carry for hundreds of miles through temperature inversions, bouncing through the sky like trapped whispers. But that doesn't explain the consistency, the shape of the sound. The fact that it was always trumpets, not bells, not howls, not drums, trumpets. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 14th century, the town of Ulm actually passed a city ordinance forbidding people from playing horns at dawn because too many people were waking up terrified, thinking the sky trumpets had come again. You hear it again now, low, resonant, vibrating through your ribs like the inside of a cathedral organ. Animals stir. A dog begins to bark. Somewhere a church bell rings prematurely. You wonder if the priest heard it too, or if he's the one ringing. The line between faith and fear was thin in the Middle Ages, and the sounds from the sky, they crossed that line effortlessly. Some believed they were warnings, the heavens crying out against corruption, war, or heresy. One friar wrote, "The sound came when the king took the coin of the poor." Another linked it to the sudden death of a noblewoman who had mocked the monks. But others thought it was communication. From what exactly, no one could agree. Angels, demons, visitors. In one preserved account from southern Italy, a nun wrote that she heard the trumpet sounds during prayer and saw a column of light descend into the forest. She never spoke again. Her diary ends with the words, "He is not dead. He waits in the sky." Who he is, unclear. But the words repeat in carvings, marginalia, even church graffiti, sometimes scratched behind stone pulpits, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in symbols no one ever translated. You look up again. The sound is fading now, long drawn out, as if whatever made it is moving away, leaving, for now. And you're left with a question the medieval world never answered. Was the sound a beginning or an end? You'd like to think it was natural, that we've just lost the science, that the past was full of explanations we no longer understand, like how glowing wounds once seemed divine. But the sky doesn't care what you think. It sings its song anyway. And if you ever hear it, low, brass, ancient, echoing over quiet fields or between cathedral spires, remember this. They heard it too, and they never figured it out. The night settles now, soft and deep, like an old cloak being drawn over your shoulders. The sounds of battle, of bells, of burning heretics, and whispering monks fade into a quiet that hums with memory, not menace. You've walked through stone corridors and candlelit shrines, through swamps thick with secrets and cathedrals echoing with lies. You've looked into glowing wounds and deeper wells. You've heard the trumpet of the sky and the silence behind a wall. And somehow, you're still here, still listening. The air around you grows cooler. Your breath slows. You start to feel your limbs again, not armored, not bloodied, just tucked into your sheets. Your skin warmed by the faint whisper of a fan, your thoughts lingering somewhere between this world and the one we've just left behind. Strange, isn't it, how much of the past still clings to us? In church vaults, in old manuscripts, in those little notches of doubt that no textbook ever bothers to explain. But maybe that's the beauty of it. The idea that history isn't a closed book. It's an attic full of half-buried boxes, each one wrapped in candle wax and shadow, daring you to peel back the lid just a little further. Not everything has to be explained. Some things are more beautiful when they're left unfinished, uncertain, slightly cracked like an old reliquary holding a dried heart that once beat for a king. So now, let your own heart slow. Let the lights stay dim. Let the mysteries rest just for a while in the back corners of your mind, like old ghosts curling into their corners, waiting politely to be remembered again another night. You're safe here. The darkness is only history, and it's time to sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.